Hello and welcome to Badger Talks Live, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Dana Craig from River Falls, Wisconsin, and I'm a sophomore studying political science and English in the College of Letters and Science. Today, we will be hearing from Professor of German Linguistics, Mark Louden, who will be talking with us about one of America's most familiar yet widely misunderstood religious groups, the Amish. A practicing Mennonite himself, Mark serves as an interpreter and cultural mediator for Amish in multiple settings. Today, he will address central aspects of Amish life and the Christian faith that anchors it, with a special emphasis on communities in Wisconsin, which has the fourth largest population of any U.S. state. Mark received his training in German linguistics at Cornell University and is a fluent speaker of Pennsylvania Dutch. He also directs the Max Kade Institute for German American Studies and is affiliated with the Religious Studies program, the Moss Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, and the Language Sciences program. Please welcome Mark Louden.
Thank you very much, Dana, for that kind introduction. And thanks to everybody who's out there, who's joining us today for taking in this event. I'm going to be doing a presentation for, about 35, 40 minutes or so, and being mindful of the time so that we can have some time for discussion and questions at the end. I welcome your questions. Whenever I'm doing a presentation on the Amish, it seems like there's absolutely no way that I could anticipate all the different questions that somebody might have. So I think it's very, very important that we have the opportunity for discussion, and I welcome your questions afterward. So let's get started here. Let's take a look at this first image that I'm going to show you on the screen, which is taken from the dust jacket of the first scholarly book that was ever published on the Amish, which appeared in 1963. And the book is still in print today. In its fourth edition. It's called Amish Society. And at this time in the 1960s, when the book appeared, a lot of people, if they thought about the Amish or had any awareness of who the Amish are at all, or heard about Amish through the media, had an image that was probably well evoked by what we see here. So black and white, stern, male, maybe patriarchal, not having a whole lot of fun. Advance the clock ahead by about 50 years or so, and there's probably not an American and a lot of other people around the world who have never heard of the Amish at all, because throughout popular media, especially most recently in sort of sensationalized TV and so-called reality TV shows, it seems like the Amish are just kind of on America's popular culture radar. And these are two so-called reality shows, and I keep using air quotes here because there's not a whole lot of reality in reality TV shows, as I think most of us recognize, and these shows are no exception. But these are the two most notorious or infamous among shows that have had a quote-unquote Amish theme or Amish hook to it: Amish Mafia and Breaking Amish. And you'll notice that the supposedly Amish people who are represented here are not sort of, older men in black and white. They're young people. And in particular, there's a lot of curiosity and rumors and urban legends about and myths about Amish young people. And supposedly this idea that Amish young people are kind of going wild. As I say, there's not a whole lot of reality in reality TV generally, and certainly for those shows that have focused on supposedly an Amish theme, that's definitely the case. But the show that's represented here on the left here, Amish Mafia, was the one that's probably the most popular, the most commercially successful, and the one that was farthest from the truth. And if you notice that there's a young man that's standing on the right side of that image there with a sawed-off shotgun. And this is something that is so completely antithetical to Amish reality, or the reality of Amish life, because members of the Amish church and related churches, like for example the church that I'm affiliated with, the Mennonite church, all of our churches are so-called peace churches, and we'll be talking about what that means in a moment. But it involves not only pacifism, not taking up arms, say in military actions, but also being so-called non-resistant, which means that even if you are attacked, or somebody whom you love is attacked, or somebody that you want to look after is being attacked, we are called not to fight back with violence, to meet violence with violence. So the whole premise of the show is basically phony, and but a lot of people think that this is actually how Amish young people are. Another source of quote unquote information or images that are disseminated in the popular media are coming from other videos. So like, for example, notice again sort of a young Amish woman on the left-hand side who seems to be doing something that one would not expect an Amish young woman to do. She was sitting in the backseat of a car and smoking a cigarette. And then there's this fascination with things like church discipline, sort of evoking Nathaniel Hawthorne and the Scarlet Letter. So shunning, which is another aspect of Amish life that generates a lot of curiosity and speculation and myth-making. But probably the largest amount of print material that's available that deals with an Amish theme are coming from romance novels. And I do frequently presentations at public libraries, and I love going to public libraries, especially in smaller communities, and chatting with the librarians beforehand. And I ask them, I say, so, you know, is there any kind of interest in the Amish among your patrons? They say, oh yeah, everybody loves the romance novels. And this is really a development over the last, maybe 15 to 20 years now. And every year there's an increasing number of titles that appear on the market. They're jokingly referred to not as bodice rippers, like stereotypical Harlequin romances, but as bonnet rippers. And basically what they are is they're romance novels, like one would find in a lot of other cultural settings, but chaste. So these would be things that would be, literature that would be considered appropriate for Christian bookstores. So there's a lot of, there are a lot of positive images that are produced by romance novels, Amish-themed romance novels. On the other hand, if you were to form an image of a community of people, of real people, based solely on romance novels set in their communities, you would not get a very accurate picture. It would be actually somewhat misleading. It could be more positive than thinking about youth sitting in the back seats of cars and smoking cigarettes. Youth gone wild that way. But on the other hand, it's not necessarily any more accurate. And so the common denominator in popular representations of the Amish is essentially extremism, right? Sort of going in exoticization, going from taking a germ of truth and then going with it and actually presenting a distorted picture. Now, this next image that I like to share is not taken from reality TV. It's not staged. It's actually real young Amish women who were photographed actually without their knowledge some years ago on rollerblades going down a back road in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, which is one of the very largest and oldest Amish communities in the United States. And this is also taken from the dust jacket of a book. And the title of that book is The Riddle of Amish Culture by a man named Donald Craybill, who is considered sort of the dean of scholars working in Amish studies across the country. And he selected this image to fit very, very nicely, I think, with the theme. It evokes very nicely the theme of his book. That in fact, the Amish really are a riddle or a puzzle to outsiders. There are a lot of questions that people have, things often having to do with dress or technology. So things like, wait, I thought Amish were not supposed to ride in vehicles, and yet I saw a van load of Amish folks pulling up to the Walmart Supercenter recently. How is that possible? Are they sneaking, right? Or are they not the real Amish? A lot of questions arise about sort of who the Amish are and what the truth is about the Amish, especially as far as their lifestyle is concerned. So in my presentation, what I'm going to be trying to do is dispel a number of those specific stereotypes by getting right to the actual core of who Amish people are. And there is, for all the romance novels and reality TV shows and other kinds of popular representations out there, there are also some excellent resources that I recommend when, for example, I teach courses that have that deal in some ways with religious studies, and I'm talking about the Amish or Mennonites or related groups. There's a lot of really good resources out there that are produced by objective observers, in many cases scholars, but written for a broader audience, right, for the curious public. One is the book on the left, The Amish, by this man Donald Craybill that I mentioned before. Also two other co-authors, eminent scholars working in the field of Amish studies, Karen Johnson Weiner and Steve Nolt. And this book is also, if you just notice at the bottom of the cover there, you see that this is a companion volume to a video, a documentary that was made some years ago now for the American Experience program that's been aired on PBS. And I highly recommend that DVD. It's something that was, the producers were very, very sensitive in working with with Amish folks, including having Amish folks actually appear in their voices in the video itself. So I recommend both the book, but especially the DVD for folks that are interested in a video presentation. And then the book on the right here, The Amish Way, Patient Faith in a Perilous World, also by two of the three same authors as the first book. But I like the subtitle here, Patient Faith in a Perilous World, because in order to really understand who Amish people are, it's not about telephones, it's not about horses and buggies, it's not about which taxes they pay or don't pay. It really comes down to how they're living out their Christian faith. And that's something that's somewhat of a surprise, I think, to many outsiders who are maybe not necessarily interested in thinking about this as a religious community, but nothing about sort of how the Amish live out their lives makes any sense unless you understand where they're coming from as a people of faith. And so I'll be spending a little bit of time to share some core doctrines that underlie the Amish path as Christians, and therefore then move on from that to be talking about things like, technology and telephones and accessing healthcare and interacting with the state, because then I think it will make a little bit more sense and we'll be able to understand the so-called riddle or paradox of Amish culture a little bit better. So just to give you a little bit of a historical background here, as I've mentioned before, the Amish are a Christian denomination, and they're part of a larger family of churches that are known as the Anabaptist family of churches. That would also include churches like, for example, the one that I'm affiliated with, Mennonite churches. And the Anabaptist movement was one that was described by contemporaries in the 15th and 16th century, outsiders, as being somewhat radical. So it was associated with the Reformation, but it was considered somewhat radical because Anabaptists, so the spiritual ancestors of Amish and Mennonites and related groups, were espousing doctrines that at the time were considered fairly controversial and somewhat different from more mainstream Protestant groups and the Roman Catholic Church. Now, if we fast forward 500 years, a lot of things that were considered radical at that time, nowadays, especially in American society, would not be considered particularly radical at all, or actually much more mainstream. So the other Christian churches have moved in the direction in many ways that Anabaptists where Anabaptists have been believing for several centuries now. A little bit about terminology now for the next 2 points here. Shorthand is that the Amish represent a splinter group off of the larger body of Anabaptists who are known today as Mennonites. So Mennonites as a group are older than the Amish. The Mennonite movement began in 1525, so the early 16th century, same time that Martin Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and contemporaries were espousing doctrines leading towards reform within the church. The name Mennonite comes from an early Anabaptist leader who is from actually Friesland, which is part of the Netherlands. His name is Menno Simons, and so his followers were known as Mennonites or Mennonists. About 175 years later or so, there was a Swiss Mennonite, although they described themselves at the time as brethren, so Swiss brethren, a man named Jakob Ammann, about whom we don't know a whole lot. We know that he was born in the Bern area of Switzerland and moved as part of a migration of other Swiss, including Swiss Anabaptists, into the Alsace region of eastern France. And in 1693, he led a splinter group off of the Swiss Brethren, Swiss Mennonites, and his followers eventually became known as the Amish, sometimes also Ammonites, but today known as the Amish. There's a whole spectrum of different Amish and Mennonite groups, but the groups that are more visible and the ones that gain the most attention in popular media are known as the Old Order Amish and Old Order Mennonites, the most traditional groups. But even within Old Order Amish and Old Order Mennonite groups, there are many, many differences. There's even just among the Old Order Amish, there are at least 40 different subgroups, so-called affiliations. The Old Order Amish population in the United States and Canada, and two tiny groups in Argentina and Belize, but vast majority are concentrated in North America. Amish population is currently 350,000. As Dana indicated in her introduction, Wisconsin has the fourth largest population, which comes in just at about 22,000. And in our neighboring state of Illinois, there are 7,200 Amish. But one important fact to keep in mind is that the Amish population is doubling every 20 years. There is no group of human beings on the planet who are increasing more rapidly than the Old Order Amish in North America. There are a handful of other very, very traditional religious groups, including Anabaptists, that have growth rates that are about the same, doubling every 20 years due to very, very high average family sizes and low attrition rates, but no group anywhere exceeds the rate of growth for the Amish in the United States and Canada. So let's share a couple of images here. This is Menno Simons, whose name I mentioned before, who's the namesake of the Mennonites. Partly why he's so well known is that he left a very, very large body of theological writings. And he was also one of the very, very few early Anabaptist leaders who lived long enough to die a natural death. Most of the early Anabaptist leaders were severely persecuted and actually executed. This is a chart that gives a sense of the present day configuration created by a scholar who got his PhD at Ohio State University, a rural sociologist, Corey Anderson. Corey put this nice chart together that indicates the four major groups of churches that fall under the Anabaptist umbrella today. Again, mainly in North America, but not exclusively to North America. So Amish and Mennonites we talked about before. Brethren, who are also known traditionally as Dunkards or Baptists, and the name German Baptist is still used. And then also a group known as the Hutterites, who are located mainly in the prairie provinces of Canada and then just south of the US border in places like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and also parts of Minnesota. So if we turn things to Wisconsin, as I say, Wisconsin is the fourth largest population. Some people joke and say every time it rains, and mushrooms come out, it's sort of, that's how Amish settlements are in the state of Wisconsin. It is a little bit hard to keep up, but one does one's best to do that. But this is a very recent representation of Amish settlements across the state. The relative size of the quilts correspond to relative sizes of the settlements, the communities in these areas. So you'll notice that there's looking in Vernon County, which is just south of La Crosse County in southwestern Wisconsin. Practically don't have enough space in Vernon County to put my quilts there. And that's because that has the largest concentration of Amish, and there are a handful of other related groups there as well. The largest settlement in the state is located near the community of Cashton, which is just north of Westby itself, not a huge town, but also Cashton, Ontario, Hillsborough, that area of central and eastern Vernon County has a very, very large Amish population. Second largest community is actually just north of where we are if you're in Dane County in Madison. So it spans basically Columbia, Green Lake, and Marquette counties. That's known as the Kingston-Dalton community. But overall, most Amish settlements in Wisconsin are located in the western and central and heading up into the northwestern part of the state, just a few in the eastern part, and then far south down toward the Illinois border. There are Old Order Mennonites, so horse and buggy driving Mennonites in the state too. Just two quilts to add here. So in Marathon County, so near the communities of Thorpe and Withee, and then down near the towns of Platteville and Lancaster, not to be confused with Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but Lancaster, Wisconsin, and Grant County. There are Old Order Mennonites there too. And so there are many aspects of lifestyle that are certainly in terms of the faith, but also to a certain extent in terms of lifestyle and how they practice their faith between Amish and Old Order Mennonites. So a lot of what I'll be talking about with Amish do apply to Mennonites as well. But shorthand is that Mennonites are a little bit more assimilated as far as technology is concerned, fewer restrictions than compared to most Amish groups. A lot of people, when they think of Amish across the country, they assume exclusively or predominantly farming. And in fact, that's been a fairly dramatic demographic change in Amish society, really over the last generation and a half to two generations, so since the 1960s. But especially in Wisconsin, you have somewhere around 20% of Amish families depending on agriculture as their main source of income. and that's relatively modest. Nationwide, it's somewhere around 15 to 20% of Amish families, depending exclusively on farming or some sort of agriculture-related business to support their families. But Amish have been very, very nimble economically and have adapted to various crises affecting small farms in the United States, including the dairy crisis, one of the many dairy crises that have affected dairy farmers here in the state of Wisconsin. So Amish are very much involved in things that in the state having things to do with wood, so furniture making, cabinet making, also things like home remodeling, roofing, things that have to do with carpentry traditionally, a very, very common Amish cottage industry. And then certainly small businesses. So like, for example, this is an image that's taken from a bulk food store and sort of Seconds grocery store in the Kingston-Dalton community. And if you're looking for really good, prices on some pretzels and cheese curls and root beer mix, these kinds of things, I highly recommend going to Amish bulk food stores. So as I say, it really doesn't make sense to understand the Amish lifestyle until you really kind of understand who they are as Christians. And there are 5 major core beliefs or areas of belief that all Anabaptists share, but that would include Amish as well. The first is our churches practice what is known as believers' baptism. So the idea is that the decision to enter into fellowship with God as a member of a particular church must be done with one's eyes wide open. And so rather than having somebody make the decision for you, it's important that people have attained what's known as the age of reason. Now, when is that? It's not a fixed year or a particular threshold that somebody crosses to be considered, past the age of reason or in the age of reason. But in general, Anabaptist churches practice a baptism somewhere sort of late teens, early adulthood. So typically before people get married. That's known as the believer's baptism, sometimes as adult baptism. That's something that's not uncommon among other Protestant churches, notably Baptist churches, which come from the English tradition. But it's not something that's necessarily, it's definitely not universal among Christian churches. The second major area of Anabaptist doctrine has to do with a belief in the separation of church and state. And if you recall, I said, going back 500 years when Anabaptists started to come on the scene in Central Europe, their ideas were considered seditious in many ways, heretical, and at a minimum radical. And both believers' baptism and the idea that church and state should be separated from one another were considered particularly problematic, in large part because church and state were intimately connected with one another, that the churches in many ways were often tools of the state or arms of the state. And by having, for example, infants baptized, this was one way of kind of keeping track of families and for taxation purposes and military conscription purposes. So, we talk about separation of church and state in the United States, not a particularly radical concept, and even in places like Europe, where many countries no longer have state churches. But again, 500 years ago, them was fighting words, so very, very radical concepts at the time. And really connected with these considered at one time radical concepts was the concept of non-resistance, which I mentioned before is not just simply not serving in the military or not engaging in violence, but also not meeting violence with violence. So that if you were attacked, you are called to follow, as a non-resistant Christian, you are called to follow Jesus' model and turn the other cheek. Now, this is something that's a very, very high bar to uphold, and it's something that is, it's considered, as a non-resistant Christian, one hopes one's faith is not tested, but sad to say, on occasion it is. And if you were to ask an Amish person, it's like, what would happen if somebody came in and started menacing you or your family? What would you do? And the typical response would be, I know what I'm called to do. Right. The fourth major point here is the idea that among Anabaptists that one's faith should be something that's kind of a 24/7 thing. So in other words, it's not just something that you think about on Sunday mornings in worship services or midweek services. It's really something that you practice on a daily basis in the way that you interact with other members of your family, your immediate community, and community including people that maybe have different views from you spiritually. So your neighbors and the folks that you live close by, share space with, work with. The term is used here in English as discipleship, which means literally following Jesus' words and deeds. So if you were to ask an Amish person, it's like, where are the sort of guidelines for everyday living? They would say, well, the entire Bible from Genesis to Revelation is the Word of God. But there's a lot of very, very practical advice and guidance that can be found in the four Gospels, and specifically what Jesus did and what Jesus taught. So there's a lot of emphasis on things like, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, which is a very, very important aspect of Jesus' legacy for Anabaptists. And also in terms of cardinal virtues or values, a lot of Amish folks and other Anabaptists will talk about the singular importance of humility, living a humble life. The German word Demut is often used, and avoiding the sins of pride. So avoiding prideful behavior. German and Pennsylvania Dutch word for that is Hochmut. And then lastly, this is something that really kind of sets the more traditional Anabaptist communities apart from, say, more progressive or so-called modern Mennonite groups, is the idea that you should live in a kind of non-conforming way, that you rely on other members of your community. You're not going to be, there's no such thing as an Amish hermit, but that you collectively stay a little bit out of step with the social mainstream, especially in the ways that, for example, the social mainstream, things like political discourse and violence and competition. If we think about, for example, materialism that comes up at Christmas time, it sort of overshadows the kind of meaning of the season. So just kind of stay, and here, the Amish are not going to be different from a lot of other folks in the social mainstream in US and Canadian society. Like, maybe things like, Black Friday or Charcoal Gray Thursday, is probably going a little bit over the line as far as overemphasizing materialism. But the non-conformity, the sort of staying out of step with the social mainstream among the more traditional Anabaptist groups, is marked somewhat outwardly or symbolically through dressing and grooming oneself distinctively, limiting technology, the term that's used with bargaining or negotiating with modernity among sociologists, and certainly language use among the Pennsylvania Dutch-speaking Anabaptist groups. Sad to say, the non-resistance question, one's very, very important aspect of the Anabaptist walk, has been put to the test. And so there are a lot of stories that are told among Amish that go back to these days of persecution. And I mentioned earlier that a lot of early Anabaptist leaders were persecuted, arrested, families torn apart from one another, and in many cases executed. And there's one story that's a fairly powerful story about an early Anabaptist leader whose name was Dirk Willems. It's represented here, and he's from the Netherlands. You can see by the representation of the windmill there off to the left. And Dirk Willems was a prominent and somewhat charismatic Anabaptist preacher and leader in his community, and he was arrested and was not going to recant his faith. Under certain circumstances that are not entirely clear, he was able to escape. Some people say, well, he lost so much weight being incarcerated, he was maybe able to sneak out of a window. Could well be that there was a sympathetic jailer that kind of turned a blind eye to him. In any case, he was able to escape and he was running away. This is a true story. And at a certain point, he was being pursued. And at a certain point, he heard one of his pursuers crash through the ice and shout for help. And so Dirk Willems stops, turns around, and runs back and pulls that man out of the ice and saves his life. And what happened? Well, the other pursuers came around him. Dirk Willems was re-incarcerated and executed. And the moral of the story of that is not Dirk Willems should have kept running, but Dirk Willems made the choice that he was called to do as a Christian. And that his reward was not in this life, but we have very, very strong hope that he will be rewarded in the next life. And so the Amish are not, looking to experience martyrdom, and certainly wouldn't want that for their members of their community. But again, it's one of those things where it's like one's faith would be put to the test. Sadly, the most singular horrific event that was ever perpetrated, a crime that was ever perpetrated against Amish people, where their faith was really very, very strongly put to the test, happened right here in the United States of America. This was not in 16th or 17th century Europe, but in early 21st century America. So almost 16 years ago, the so-called Nickel Mines shooting. This was one of the early horrendous school shootings that sadly has plagued American society since then. Nickel Mines is a small unincorporated community in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and a mentally disturbed man from the community, but not of Amish or Mennonite background, came in and sent the boys and the teachers and a couple of moms out. There were 10 girls remaining in there, lined them up in the front of the blackboard and shot them execution style. 5 were killed, and the other 5 young girls were wounded. And the reaction, obviously worldwide, was one of horror. And certainly in the media community, but within hours, a small group of Amish in the immediate neighborhood reached out to the shooter's family, and the shooter had committed suicide in the schoolhouse, reached out to the shooter's family and expressed on behalf of their community their forgiveness, and said that they wanted to express the support for the family. His widow and children and parents and her parents were absolutely horrified. They had no indication what their loved one was capable of doing and what he actually did. Mr. Roberts did, and so the family was incredibly grateful for the agape, for the sacrificial love that was expressed on behalf of the surviving community, including the survivors' families. And so I highly recommend, there's a number of things that have been written about that, but again, another book by folks working in the field of Amish studies, the book Amish Grace, How Forgiveness Transcended Tragedy, is something that I highly recommend in terms of understanding the significance of this, of how the Amish faith has been put into practice. Sad to say that Amish are targets of crimes, in part because there's an awareness that they will not fight back. And so Wisconsin has not been immune from that. Amish, crimes against Amish have been in the state as long as there have been Amish here, which goes back about a century now, but really is more in the sort of early 1990s, mid 1990s, when we start to get actual reports of crimes against Amish in Wisconsin. So this is a headline that was taken from, reported from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel going back in the late 1990s. Now, just to kind of move towards connecting Amish faith with sort of whom the Amish are in community and opening things up for questions, I'll just be sharing some images with you. As I mentioned before, it's just not possible to be Amish and to be a hermit. There's not a whole lot of privacy in Amish society, which for folks on the outside, can seem a little bit uncomfortable, I guess, if you don't feel like you have a whole lot of private space. But if it's something that you've grown up with, there's an incredible amount of security that comes from that. And especially as you get older, the idea that that people have your back, that people care about you, that people are aware of how you're doing, especially if you're experiencing some sort of crisis, that's something that really it provides a kind of lowercase social security, right? Which is something that's, I think, very, very important. So from cradle to grave, there's a lot of support, community support in Amish society. And it's essentially unheard of that Amish elders would be put into distinct retirement communities or nursing homes. Even if they have very, very significant medical needs, they will be cared for within the community. And that connection across the generations is something that I think is a win-win situation for younger folks and younger and older folks alike. I mentioned that non-conformity is a very, very important aspect of living out the traditional Anabaptist faith. An important symbol of community identity is dressing distinctively. It's understood from the plain perspective, not as an aspect of repression, but as a way of kind of marking one's satisfaction with one's identity. Frequently, if I'm teaching a class on the UW-Madison campus and I look around and I see a lot of red and white, and sometimes green and gold, right, for the Green Bay Packers. And you ask people, it's like, why are you wearing red and white? I say, well, I feel good about the fact that I'm a student at UW-Madison. Or why are you wearing green and gold? It's like, go Pack. And so if you think about it, that's, we mark our loyalties, our sympathies, our identities, the larger groups of people that we connect with in outward ways. We wear little flags on our lapels. And so really dressing distinctively is kind of like wearing a uniform, not that you have to, but you choose to because you've made a decision to consciously, with your eyes wide open, to join this community that offers you so much love and security. Technology and limiting technology is another way of marking non-conformity, as I say, kind of staying a little bit out of line with identity. In the same way that we saw that image of the girls tooling around rural Lancaster County on rollerblades, Amish society is not static. So Amish, life today is not the same as it was 50 years ago, and certainly 100 years ago, and going back to 1693. Very, very different. Certainly in the ways of, in aspects of technology. So the question is, the Amish pick and choose, but how do they pick and choose? What are some of the conscious decisions that they make? Well, it's not really based on scripture so much as it is based on sort of the idea, how can technology promote healthy community life and maybe tamp down individualism to a certain extent. So let's consider two technological fixtures of modern American Canadian life. A washer and dryer up there, and a dishwasher. And it's safe to say that in many, many North American homes, you've got at least a washer, often a dryer, and not infrequently you have dishwashers. And in Amish society, you have washing machines, but no dryers and no dishwashers. And you say, well, wait a second. Why is one of these three appliances good and the other two not good, right? Is there a scripture? Is there some sort of biblical basis for it? No, there's absolutely no scriptural basis for that whatsoever. It all has to do with the tasks to which these technological appliances are put. So if you think about clothes washing, right? All Amish homes have clothes washers. Now they don't have front loaders. They have wringer washers, right? So it's kind of low tech, but it's nonetheless, this is mechanized clothes washing here that's going on. The actual washing of clothes is not a particularly group-oriented activity, right? It's something that's fairly solitary. And in fact, it's something that really basically just kind of one person can handle pretty well. So you load the washer, let it spin, take it through the wringer, rinse it, wring it out again, and so forth, and then prepare to put them on the line. So why is a washer permitted but not a dryer? Well, first off, you're not taking away from community life by having a washing machine. A dryer, you can enlist the help of a few people, right, already to put the clothes on the line. And quite honestly, it's cheaper and more eco-friendly to have line-dried laundry. And for any of us who have actually done laundry at home and not had a dryer and used a clothesline, it's actually a little bit better in some ways. It's a little bit more time intensive. You may not be using sort of scented fabric softener sheets or something like that, but there's something about the smell of line-dried laundry that's actually quite nice. If we take a look at the third image here, washing dishes. Now this is something the activity of washing dishes is something that's profoundly communal, because you can have kids as young as maybe 4 or 5 clearing the table, bringing the dishes. There's not going to be a whole lot to scrape off, so they don't have to worry about that. Prep them for washing, wash, rinse, dry, put away. You can get a whole line of people working together, and what are you doing? You're talking, you're joking, you're singing, you're telling stories, you're having a good time. And activities like that, which outsiders would view as a chore or something to be, a drudge, is viewed as an opportunity for doing something, getting something done, and having a good time, because it's all about spending time in community, enjoying one another's company. Now, there's a phrase that's been used by another scholar of Amish studies that talked about specifically the telephone, and I love the way that she described it. She says, holding the line on the telephone and holding the line on technology. And Amish actually, when the telephone came out in the early 20th century, Amish were in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, for example, were right on board with it. Say, hey, this is a great thing, for business purposes and all kinds of conveniences. And then they realized fairly quickly, if I have a telephone in the middle of my room and it rings, that may be a bother. It may be a disturbance. And so, like, for example, this is taken from a movie from, I think, the 1940s or 1950s. And these people are like kind of annoyed that somebody's gotten up from the table to answer the telephone. And so the Amish say, well, let's have our cake and eat it too, and like have the advantages of a telephone and certainly the security of the telephone and things like emergencies, but not have it in the middle of our house. So we have things like, for example, phones in barns, phones in little phone booths that are called phone shanties, or phones that are actually in neighbors' basements where they actually pay the contract and pay the fees for that. This is an Amish phone shanty in rural Wisconsin where you say, it's there when I need it as a tool, but it's not there to disturb me when I don't want to be disturbed. Now, the Amish will stand their ground on certain things. We talk about non-resistance, which is basically not committing violent behavior, either offensively, but also defensively, but the Amish will also hold the line in certain other ways. And for example, in the area of education, there was a Supreme Court decision that came down in 1972 that started right here in Wisconsin. In fact, in an Amish community that no longer exists just south of Madison in the New Glarus area. The New Glarus community was one of a number of communities across the United States where they were resisting the state telling the parents that they needed to send their children to school at least through up to the age of 16. Amish parochial education is limited formally to 8 grades. And it's something that we could get into the discussion, the terms of that, but it was a 9-0. It was a unanimous Supreme Court decision in 1972 that came down that basically says, if you validate the Amish right to exist, you have to validate the choices that Amish parents make for their children, raising them to become part of the Amish community, which you've already validated. So therefore, an important aspect of child rearing is making decisions for one's children. And the Supreme Court decided that parents were in a better position than the state to decide what's more appropriate for education. Now, the rest of American society is sort of caught up in the sense of things like more independent schools, parochial schools, private schools, homeschooling, no schooling, all kinds of other educational alternatives that are much more common today than they were in the late 1960s and early 1970s. But that's one thing that came up here in Wisconsin. Also, there have been cases about things like making exemptions on building codes. This is something that some folks may be familiar with in Wisconsin news in recent years. Also, buggy lighting. So Amish are all about safety, but they're concerned about certain aspects of lighting that they may think is more or less appropriate. They say, are there other ways of operating our buggy safely, especially at nighttime, using tape or reflectors, that sort of thing. So there are various compromises that have been made between the state and Amish communities as far as buggy lighting goes. And then one area that I'm very, very personally involved in as a medical interpreter and patient navigator, a lot of my outreach work deals with medical questions across the state. And this includes advocating for greater acceptance of Amish traditional approaches to health and well-being. And one thing that I'm absolutely a strong advocate for is an Amish developed protocol for treating burns and severe wounds that's known as the B&W, stands for burns and wounds, B&W/burdock, as in burdock leaves. Protocol. And here you see a little canister of B&W salve, which is a natural salve, honey-based, a lot of other herbal ingredients there, and it's called burdock leaves. And this was an image that I took a year and a half ago from a case of an Amish boy who was not burned, but got his hand caught in an auger, and so it was a very serious kind of injury there. And through the application of the B&W method, under the supervision or the attendance of a plastic surgeon, the Amish caregivers were able to save the kid's finger from being amputated, which was a pretty neat story. So again, that's one of the many ways that we could follow things up in the discussion. And I want to wrap up with a discussion of the COVID situation. By and large, when the restrictions coming down to COVID were happening and starting in early March and then into April, the Amish were obeying the outside laws, closing the schools, suspending church services. Nowadays, the mood among Amish communities is a little bit impatient, not unlike what one finds in rural America generally. There are some Amish folks that have become a little bit skeptical about the seriousness of the pandemic. But when the pandemic came down, they were doing their responsibility as good citizens and respecting authority. And this is one poem that was written at the time that I'm going to share with you. That talks about their duty as Christians to basically obey just laws, to respect laws, as they say here, in the era of COVID and the pandemic. And this is an anagram, you notice, that spells out coronavirus. Call to Christians everywhere, On your knees, seek God in prayer. Reach to those who need the Lord. Onward then with one accord. Never fear. Examples be, and obey implicitly. Verily thou shalt be blessed. In this tumult you'll find rest. Remember to respect the laws. Understand defiance falls. So be ready when God calls. And by way of wrapping up, I'm just going to give you one last aspect, a symbol of community identity. Dana indicated that I speak Pennsylvania Dutch, which is the primary language in group among Amish society. I'm going to leave you with this last image, a visual image of Pennsylvania Dutch, but I'm going to recite this to you. This is an example of a book of children's Bible stories written in Pennsylvania Dutch. The title is Vella Lesa, which means let's read. Subtitle is Bibelstories voor Kinderen. I'm not giving you a translation here because this is the very beginning of the creation story. So a paraphrase of the beginning of Genesis 1:1, chapter 1. And I'll be reading this in Pennsylvania Dutch. You can follow along. You'll be able to pick up a few words anyway because of the similarity with English. But the plot should be familiar. De staat van die aard. Wie lang terug het geen aard gehad, geen licht, geen helling. Es war alles weer dunkel geweest. Verster damit hat Gott der Himmel und die Erde gemacht. Nur er gesagt, lass es Licht sein. Just wie selber was Licht gewesen. Gott hat's Licht Tag gekäse und dunkel Nacht. Das war nur der erste Tag, das Leben war. Der nächste Tag hat die Wolke gemacht. Hat die Luft gemacht, so es man schnaufen kann. Auf den dritten Tag hat das Wasser ins Land verteilt. Hat die See in die Himmel gemacht, alle Tag. Hat noch gesagt, lass die Bäume ins Gras sterben wachsen. Und sie haben noch stark wachsen. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you for coming and for listening. I'd be happy to answer any questions in the time that we have remaining. All right, I'm looking at the chat here and starting off with my buddy Simon Bronner. Nice to see you here, Simon. He points out that the Hasidim, the so-called ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox Jews who also dress and groom themselves distinctively, outwardly very, very similar, also growing at a very, very high rate of growth, of birth rates. Absolutely correct. The Hasidim have an almost identical growth rate to the Old Order Amish, due also to an average family size of somewhere around 7 to 8 children and a very, very high retention rate, somewhere north of 90%. Next question here, I mentioned that the population is doubling every 20 years, mostly due to average family size or people converting as well. Great question, Sue. It is almost exclusively due to natural increase. So large family sizes, so triple to quadruple the US average. And then it's not just about having lots of kids, it's having lots of kids with access to a healthcare network where the kids and moms will survive, right? So there's no birth control that's practiced, and that's true for a lot of traditional societies, but there's still a very high infant mortality rate elsewhere. So, but if you're living in the United States and Canada and say and countries with similar healthcare systems, then the chances of children being healthy are surviving infancy and early childhood are greater. And there's and also retention. So it's somewhere between 85 and 90% of young people who are deciding whether to join the Amish church make the decision to do that. Also, as correct, Thorpe and Wither in Clark County, not Marathon counties, that's where the older Mennonite communities are. There's a very, very low rate of people that join the traditional older Amish groups. Last estimate I heard is out of 350,000, there's maybe somewhere around 250 folks who are not born to Amish parents who made the decision to join. So it's very, very small. Are there trained medical personnel among the Amish communities? Yes, there are some that actually have formal medical training, nurses or sort of nursing training, but most people that are kind of community caregivers are not formally trained, but or not trained by biomedical professionals, but are sort of, we could say, sort of almost like barefoot doctors, chiropractors, herbalists, which is how actually the B&W Burdock protocol was developed. Bobby, I see, has got a question here. Say a little bit about the use of the German language among contemporary Amish. So basically, the everyday language, the oral language of communication among the Amish is Pennsylvania Dutch. This is the sample that I gave you at the end there, which if you know German, they're not really mutually intelligible with one another. It's been 250 plus years of development, apart from a group of German dialects that were brought to colonial Pennsylvania. Standard German, High German, is familiar to Amish people, but mainly for receptive or passive needs. So as the language of the Bible, hymnals, prayer books, it's a language that's mainly read and recited. It's not something that you typically write new texts in or have spontaneous conversations in. It is taught as a subject in Amish parochial schools. So it's something that has sort of, you know, it's not the same as, say, High German in modern Germany today. Let's see here. A little bit about gender roles that somebody asked here. The term that's often used by sociologists to describe traditional Anabaptist society is soft patriarchy. So in other words, it's in terms of positions of authority, it's definitely males who are occupying these positions. So males that are members, only eligible people for the ministry, which includes 3 levels, bishop, minister, and deacon. In terms of outward spokespersons for communities, it's almost exclusively males. In interacting with authorities, in some cases with healthcare too, it's often males. But behind the scenes, and there's a real distribution of labor there. So in other words, behind the scenes, women have a lot, plain women have a lot of say in sort of how the choices that their families make for things like purchasing a home, their economic situation generally, certainly healthcare. So it's something that's not necessarily visible to the outside. There's definitely clear sort of gender roles, but it's equitable. Everybody's working hard. Everybody has a lot to do. It's just that, you know, males are more associated with certain domains typically than females, but there's also a lot of overlap with that. Let's see here. How many people leave the community after Rumspringa? Rumspringa is probably the greatest misunderstanding that people have about Amish young people. It literally means running around, which does the concept no good, because people assume that by default means going wild. So sitting in the back of cars, smoking cigarettes and drinking beer. Rumspringa does not mean going wild. It does not mean sowing one's wild oats. What that means is that you've turned 16 and that you are eligible in your community to socialize with other unmarried young people without adult supervision. And in the vast majority of communities, especially here in Wisconsin, which tends to be a little bit more traditional in some ways, certainly in how young people interact with one another, that means things like, you know, volleyball games, going to singings, drinking lemonade, just playing you know, nice games with one another, socializing, and not going wild. In the same way that you think about your typical public high school graduating class, and there's, you know, certain cliques and groups, you know, there's going to be some element at larger high schools that are going to be doing the going wild party animal type route. And you find this at universities and colleges and all that too. But in fact, that's a real minority among the Amish. And that kind of wild behavior, which definitely titillates and is really exciting for people in the media and their neighbors and communities, make it into the newspapers. This is exceptional behavior, and it's really much more common in larger communities. So like in Eastern Ohio, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and Northern Indiana. So. Let's see here. So the question is about the relationship between Anabaptists and other groups. So like Baptists, so I mentioned at the beginning that Mennonites are a part of the Anabaptist family of churches. Pennsylvania Dutch is actually an ethnic linguistic term that describes people of colonial German ancestry. Ancestors came during the 18th century to colonial Pennsylvania. And that included Anabaptists, but it included mainly more mainstream Protestants, so Lutherans and Reformed. So it's not a religious terminology. Quakers share a lot in common, and that's no accident, because Quakers were the people that invited Anabaptists and other German-speaking immigrants to Pennsylvania in the 18th century. In fact, certain aspects of Amish dress were actually carried over, influenced by Quakers. the big black hats, for example, and also certain aspects of head coverings, eventually bonnets, which go on top of the covering for women. That was also taken over from the Quakers. Church of the Latter-day Saints, also known as popularly as the Mormon Church, that is not part of the same Anabaptist family of churches. It's a distinct branch of Christianity. So black bonnets versus white means what? Just one little terminology here. A lot of people talk about bonnets referring to the head coverings, often of organdy, that are made for women. They're actually not called covering or bonnets. They're called coverings or veils or caps. A bonnet is something that goes like a sun bonnet that goes on top of that. But shorthand, a lot of people just refer to them as bonnets. It depends on the community, typically black. If a community, young women wear black coverings, then those black coverings signify being single. That's one thing. But among older Mennonites, you've got, for example, white coverings, fairly stiff, with black ribbons. And that's a practical thing because it doesn't show the dirt as much. So all kinds of different styles that have to do with coverings. Shorthand is the fairly larger coverings, those that cover more of the head, are associated with more traditional groups, more conservative groups. The smaller coverings, including among more progressive Mennonite groups, signify sort of greater assimilation with the social mainstream. Do Amish accept modern medical care? Yes, but it's a little bit like technology. You pick and choose. One, we could talk a lot about that, but just one point I'll leave you with is that the Amish do not purchase private medical insurance because that's profit driven, and they think that that's not a moral decision. It's an appropriate moral decision to make. They don't think that people should be profiting off of other people's healthcare, either as a provider of the healthcare or as insurers. So they do not buy private insurance. There are some mutual aid plans in some communities that's nonprofit, but by and large, they pay things out of pocket and they have community aid. They also will not accept government assistance. And so one of the few exemptions that they received from the federal government is that they were, when there was a mandate, there's no longer a mandate, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, the mandate did not apply to them and similar groups that reject government assistance on religious grounds or spiritual grounds. And so cost is a kind of a big deal. If you've ever looked at an itemized bill before insurance or Medicare, Medicaid has paid for it, you will be shocked at the sticker price. And so Amish deacons typically try and negotiate deals with healthcare providers, and that's usually, for catastrophic expenses, so things like tertiary care facilities, so big hospitals and large networks. But in principle, they don't reject formal medical care, biomedical care, but they are savvy consumers. Question here about prepaid phones. Are young people using phones? Cell phones or mobile telephones are something that is it's largely not accepted in most communities. Smartphones are rejected across the board. Where cell phones are permitted, it's kind of the traditional flip phones. But then if they are permitted in a community, it's considered for business purposes only. So it's not really necessarily, it's not a youth thing or old thing. It's really, something that's, the community has decided whether they're going to accept mobile telephones. Another question from my buddy Simon regarding medical care. The state wanted to discourage Amish midwives and required licensing. This is something that has come up in a lot of different states. New York State has had a fairly strict licensing requirement. Technically, Amish midwives who are not formally licensed, which is essentially all of them, would be called birth attendants. And so each state's have different regulations for birth attendants versus formally licensed midwives. But I have to say, in Wisconsin, midwives are amazing, absolutely amazing. And the partnerships that have been developed between formally licensed midwives and Amish communities, including Amish birth attendants, are just absolutely beautiful. Amish midwives, or midwives that serve Amish communities, not only in Wisconsin, but elsewhere, are really on the front lines of providing amazing care to Amish families, and also really serving as a kind of a bridge. And so obviously things that deal with pregnancy and childbirth and postpartum, but also, just sort of talking about health and well-being generally. I'm just absolutely in awe of what midwives do. And some been wonderful stories of community partnerships, including through clinics here in Wisconsin. I think we're going to be sort of wrapping up things here. So about with 1 minute, looks like. The question here from Nancy, how are mental health issues dealt with in the community? That's a really, really important frontier. It's tricky because it's mental health among the Amish is among a lot of communities, but among the Amish is not as well understood. In terms of like being able to tease apart what is mental or behavioral health versus spiritual health. And there's a reluctance in many ways to sort of name problems, to name issues that maybe people are struggling with things like, depression or certain kinds of mental disorders. And there are a lot of cultural barriers to accessing things like therapy. Again, this is a society where the individual is somewhat de-emphasized in favor of the collective. And if you think about therapy, yes, there's group therapy, but much therapy is an individual activity. So between the therapist and the individual. And Amish people are very hesitant in many circumstances, especially very sensitive circumstances, to speak about oneself in the first person singular, I, me, I. It's more sort of first person plural. So there are some hurdles that need to be overcome there. One sort of positive development in addressing mental health is for folks plain people that need inpatient care. There are facilities that have been founded that are essentially partnerships between outside professionals and insiders in the community, where if plain people need to be inpatients, they can go and receive the care that they need, but in a culturally appropriate context. So I guess that's all. We're out of time here, but I'm really, really grateful. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to answer everybody's question. I hope I was able to deal with most of them. I am reachable by email through the University of Wisconsin-Madison. You can just simply Google my name. I'd be happy to answer questions from folks by email if you're ever happy to engage. So thanks so much for coming today. I'm really, really grateful of the turnout that we had, and I wish you a great rest of the week.